The first time Jack Everson laid eyes on Willow Kearney at the Silver Dollar Saloon, he felt something shift inside him, like the ground beneath his boots had suddenly given way. Trouble was, she wore another man's ring, and in Gila City, Arizona territory, 1877, that meant she was as untouchable as water in the desert. The July heat hung heavy over the dusty streets as Jack pushed through the batwing doors of the saloon, seeking refuge from both the scorching afternoon sun and the lingering solitude of the trail. 3 weeks of driving cattle had left him parched in more ways than one. The familiar sounds of clinking glasses, scattered conversations, and the tinny piano in the corner washed over him as he made his way to the bar. "Whiskey," Jack said, dropping a coin on the counter. His voice was rough from disuse, having spoken to nothing but cattle and his horse for the better part of a month. The barkeep, a portly man with thinning hair and suspicious eyes, slid the amber liquid toward him. "New in town," Jack nodded, knocking back the whiskey in one swift motion. "Just passing through." He set the glass down, feeling the burn travel down his throat and settle warmly in his stomach. "Delivered a herd to the Prescott outfit north of here. Cattle business doing well then?" "Well enough." Jack gestured for another drink. At 27, he'd been working cattle drives since he was 16, saving every penny he could. One day he'd have land of his own, maybe even start a small ranch. For now, though, he was just another cowboy with calloused hands and dust in his boots. The piano player struck up a livelier tune, drawing Jack's attention to the far end of the room. That's when he saw her, moving between tables with a grace that seemed entirely out of place in the rough surroundings. She wore a simple blue dress, her chestnut hair pinned up except for a few rebellious strands that framed her face. As she turned, the light from the window caught her profile, revealing high cheekbones and lips curved in a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Who's that?" Jack found himself asking before he could stop the words. The barkeep followed his gaze. "Willow Kearney, or rather, Willow Donovan now. Married to Frank Donovan, owns the largest spread east of here." He gave Jack a knowing look. "Best keep your eyes to yourself, cowboy. Frank's not a man who shares what's his." Jack nodded, though he couldn't tear his gaze away. There was something in the way she moved, a kind of restrained dignity that hinted at depths beneath her careful exterior. As if sensing his attention, Willow turned, her eyes meeting his across the room. For a moment, neither looked away. Something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, or merely curiosity. Then she lowered her gaze and continued her task of collecting empty glasses. Jack forced himself to turn back to his drink. He wasn't looking for trouble, especially not the kind that came with another man's wife. Tomorrow he'd collect his pay and move on, maybe head toward New Mexico territory or even Texas. His thoughts were interrupted by the saloon doors swinging open with such force that they banged against the walls. The piano player faltered, and the room fell quiet as a tall man with a shock of graying hair and expensive clothes strode in. The way people shifted in their seats told Jack this was someone of consequence. "Frank," the barkeep acknowledged, reaching for a bottle of the good whiskey kept under the counter. So this was Frank Donovan. Jack studied him from behind his glass. The man was perhaps 15 years older than Willow, with hard eyes and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. Money and power clung to him like trail dust. "Afternoon, Earl," Frank said, scanning the room until his gaze landed on Willow. His expression darkened. "Thought I told you to be home by 3. Got the Hargrove family coming for dinner." Willow straightened, her face composed, though Jack noticed her hands tighten around the tray she was holding. "I'm sorry, Frank. Mrs. Parker needed extra help today. I was just finishing up." Frank approached her, placing a hand on her arm that looked gentle enough to those watching but made Willow tense visibly. "You're my wife, not a common barmaid. Your place is at the house." "Yes, Frank." Her voice was quiet but not meek. "I'll head back now." As Willow set down her tray and moved to retrieve her shawl from behind the bar, Frank turned to the barkeep. "Earl, I told you before about letting her work here." Earl shifted uncomfortably. "She's just helping out occasionally, Frank. Clara's been sick and we're short-handed." "Well, find someone else. It's not proper." Frank's voice was reasonable, but something in his tone made the hairs on the back of Jack's neck rise. He'd known men like Frank Donovan before, men who wore their wealth and influence like armor while hiding something darker beneath. Willow returned to her husband's side, her shawl draped around her shoulders despite the heat. "I'm ready." Frank nodded, placing a possessive hand at the small of her back. As they turned to leave, Jack noticed the resigned set of Willow's shoulders and the way her eyes remained downcast. It was none of his business, he reminded himself, turning back to his drink. But as the couple reached the door, another man entered, a ranch hand by the look of him, dusty and trail-worn. "Mr. Donovan," the newcomer said, "we've got trouble at the south pasture." "Jeffries thinks someone's been tampering with the irrigation ditch again." Frank cursed under his breath. "Those Alvarez boys, I bet." He turned to Willow. "Go on home and get things ready. I'll be along later." Willow nodded, stepping around the ranch hand and out into the street. Frank watched her go before turning back to the man. "Tell me what's happening," he said, guiding the ranch hand toward a table in the corner. Jack signaled for another drink, intending to finish it and head out. He had a room at the boarding house and planned to get a good night's sleep before collecting his pay in the morning. But as he nursed his whiskey, he couldn't help overhearing fragments of Frank's conversation. "Third time this month. Warned them already." Then Frank's voice rose slightly. "If this keeps up, I'll handle it personally. Make an example." Jack kept his eyes on his glass, appearing disinterested. It wasn't uncommon for ranchers to have disputes over water rights or property lines, but something in Frank's tone made Jack uneasy. As the conversation continued, Frank's voice grew lower, but in the lull that had fallen over the saloon, his words carried. "I've about had it with everything lately. The ranch, the town council, and especially that wife of mine." The ranch hand mumbled something Jack couldn't catch. "She's been different since her father died." Frank's voice was bitter now. "Thinks she's entitled to have opinions on how I run things. Found her going through my account books last week." "Maybe she's just trying to help, boss," Frank snorted. "Help? She's getting ideas above her station, is what she's doing. Talking about selling some of the land to pay off debts. Land her father practically gave away to me when I married her." There was a pause, and when Frank spoke again, his voice had dropped to a menacing whisper that Jack had to strain to hear. "I've worked too hard building what I have to let a woman tear it down. If she keeps pushing me, she'll regret it. Might be an accident happens." "Plenty of dangerous things on a ranch." The ranch hand laughed nervously. "You don't mean that, boss." "Don't I?" Frank's voice was cold. "She's becoming more trouble than she's worth. And if there's one thing I learned from my father, it's that a man deals with his troubles permanently." Jack felt his hand tighten around his glass. He'd heard men talk big before, especially when liquor was involved, but the calculated way Frank discussed harming his wife sent ice through Jack's veins. "I'll give her one more chance to remember her place," Frank continued. "After tonight's dinner. But if she defies me again." He left the threat hanging. "Now, about those Alvarez boys." As the conversation turned back to ranch matters, Jack finished his whiskey and stood. He'd never considered himself a particularly noble man, just someone trying to make his way in a harsh world. But what he'd just overheard was different. Frank Donovan wasn't making idle threats. He was a man capable of violence who had just laid out his intentions plainly. Outside, the afternoon had progressed toward evening, the heat still oppressive but the angle of the sun suggesting relief would come eventually. Jack stood on the boardwalk for a moment, wrestling with his conscience. It wasn't his place to get involved in a married couple's business, no matter how troubling. And yet, he couldn't shake the memory of Willow's eyes when they'd briefly met his intelligent and somehow trapped, like a wild thing caught in a snare. Before he fully realized what he was doing, Jack found himself walking toward the livery stable. He needed to see where the Donovan place was, at least, just to satisfy his curiosity. The livery owner, a grizzled old man named Potter, was happy to talk. Donovan Ranch. Big white house about 3 miles east of town. Can't miss it. Biggest spread in the county. He eyed Jack suspiciously. You got business there, just curious, Jack said casually. Heard Donovan might be hiring. Potter snorted. He goes through hands pretty regular. Doesn't treat him well, and the pay's no better than anywhere else despite his money. The old man spat tobacco juice into the dirt. If you're looking for work, try the Marshall outfit west of here. Better boss, better conditions. As Potter rambled on about the various ranches in the area, Jack's mind was racing. He'd already made up his mind, though he wasn't entirely sure what he intended to do. Warn Willow, certainly, but then what? Can I rent a horse for the night? Jack asked, interrupting Potter's discourse on the proper way to shoe a stubborn mule. Sure thing. $5, back by noon tomorrow. Jack paid, selecting a sturdy bay gelding that looked fast but not flashy. As he saddled up, he tried to convince himself he was simply doing what any decent man would do, warning someone of danger. Nothing more. But as he rode out of town toward the Donovan Ranch, he knew he was crossing a line. And once crossed, there would be no going back. The Donovan house was exactly as Potter had described it, a grand 2-story white structure rising out of the landscape, like something from back east, with a wide porch wrapping around the front and one side. It stood on a small rise, surrounded by well-tended grounds that gave way to working ranch land beyond. Even in the failing light, Jack could see it represented significant wealth in a territory where most people lived in simple wooden structures or adobe. He approached cautiously, keeping to the shadows of the cottonwood trees that lined the long drive. Several wagons and horses were tethered at the front of the house, confirming that the dinner guests Frank had mentioned had arrived. Lights glowed from the downstairs windows, and Jack could hear the murmur of conversation and occasional laughter. Moving his horse around to the side of the house, he studied the windows, trying to determine which might belong to Willow. The second floor was dark except for a soft light at the far end. Taking a chance, he guided his horse closer, staying under the cover of trees. He was just considering how to get Willow's attention when the back door opened, spilling light onto the porch. Jack quickly retreated deeper into the shadows, watching as Willow herself emerged. She carried a small basket and moved to a garden at the side of the house, kneeling to gather what looked like fresh herbs. Jack's heart raced. This was his chance. He dismounted quietly, tethering his horse to a tree, and approached her, staying low. "Mrs. Donovan," he called softly when he was close enough. Willow startled, rising quickly with her hand at her throat. "Who's there?" Jack stepped forward just enough for her to see him in the fading light. "I'm not here to harm you. We saw each other earlier at the saloon." Recognition dawned in her eyes, followed quickly by wariness. "What do you want? If my husband finds you here, that's why I've come," Jack interrupted, glancing toward the house. "I overheard him at the saloon after you left. He made threats against you, madam, serious ones." Willow's face went still. What did he say exactly? Jack hesitated, then decided honesty was necessary. He said if you didn't remember your place, an accident might happen to you. He sounded like he meant it. She didn't look surprised, which troubled Jack more than if she had. I see. Do you have family you could go to? Somewhere safe? Willow shook her head. My father died last year. My mother's been gone since I was a child. She gestured vaguely westward. I have an aunt in California, but... She trailed off, her shoulders slumping slightly. Jack made a decision then that would change the course of both their lives. I can help you leave, tonight if need be. Willow's eyes widened. Leave? I couldn't possibly, Mrs. Donovan. Willow, I believe your life is in danger. I wouldn't be here otherwise. She studied him, her eyes searching his face. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. It was a fair question, and one Jack wasn't entirely sure how to answer. Because it's the right thing to do, he said finally, and because no one deserves to live in fear. Willow looked back at the house, conflict clear on her face. The guests will be here for hours yet. Frank won't come upstairs until late. Jack nodded. I'll leave my horse tethered in those trees. He pointed to a thick stand of cottonwoods about 50 yards from the house. It'll be ready whenever you decide. I'll wait until midnight. And if I don't come, then I'll leave and you can pretend we never had this conversation. Willow looked down at the herbs in her basket, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle. I don't even know your name. Jack. Jack Everson. Well, Mr. Everson, you're risking a great deal for a stranger. Jack shrugged. Some risks are worth taking. A voice called from the house, a woman, probably one of the dinner guests, looking for Willow. I have to go, she said urgently. Which window is yours? Jack asked quickly. Second from the right, upstairs. There's a trellis with climbing roses. Jack nodded. Remember midnight, the horse will be waiting. Willow hesitated, then nodded once before hurrying back toward the house, composing her features into a pleasant mask as she went. Jack retreated to the trees, his heart pounding. He just offered to help a married woman flee her husband, a powerful man in the territory. If Frank Donovan caught him, Jack had no illusions about what would happen. Men had been hung for less. He led his horse deeper into the cottonwoods, finding a spot with a clear view of Willow's window while remaining hidden from the house. Now all he could do was wait and hope she would choose freedom over fear. Inside the Donovan home, Willow moved through the evening as if in a dream. She poured coffee for the guests, smiled at appropriate moments, and answered questions about the new curtains in the dining room. All the while, her mind raced with the cowboy's Jack's warning and offer. Was she truly in danger? The rational part of her mind said yes. Frank's temper had grown increasingly volatile in the past year, especially since her father's death had left him in control of not only his own holdings, but what remained of the Kearney ranch as well. The bruises on her arms from his corrective grips had become more frequent, and last week, when she'd suggested selling some land to pay down the mounting debts she'd discovered in his ledgers, the look in his eyes had terrified her. But to flee, to leave everything she'd known. As she refilled Mrs. Hargrove's teacup, Willow caught Frank watching her from across the room, his eyes narrowed. He raised his glass slightly in her direction, a gesture that might have appeared friendly to others but which she recognized as a warning. Remember your place. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the guests finally began to depart. Willow stood beside Frank on the porch, smiling and waving as the Hargroves and the Pattersons climbed into their wagons. As soon as the last wagon disappeared down the drive, Frank's hand clamped around her upper arm, pulling her back into the house. What were you thinking, questioning me about the north pasture in front of Patterson? He hissed, his fingers digging into her flesh. Making me look like I don't know my own business. Willow winced but met his gaze steadily. I only mentioned that Mr. Patterson's new irrigation system might help with our water issues. I wasn't questioning you. You made me look foolish." Frank released her with a small shove. "Go upstairs. I'm going to have another drink." Willow rubbed her arm where his fingers had left marks. "Frank, I think we need to talk about the bank note that came yesterday. If we don't make the payment—" "I said go upstairs." Frank's voice rose, his face flushing. "I'll handle the finances, same as I always have. Your father knew you didn't have the head for business, that's why he arranged our marriage in the first place." The words stung, especially because Willow knew they weren't true. Her father had arranged the marriage because Frank had called in loans that would have bankrupted the Kearney ranch otherwise. It had been a business transaction disguised as a marriage with Willow as the collateral. "Yes, Frank," she said quietly, turning toward the stairs. "And Willow." His voice stopped her. "Don't think I didn't notice you and Clara Parker whispering at church last Sunday. If I find out you've been talking about our private matters." The threat hung in the air between them. Willow nodded once and continued up the stairs, her heart pounding. In her bedroom, she moved to the window, looking out toward the cottonwoods where Jack Everson waited with a horse. Could she really do this? Leave everything behind and flee with a stranger? But what was she leaving, really? A loveless marriage that had become increasingly dangerous. A house that felt more like a prison than a home. Even the land she loved, her father's land, was no longer truly hers. Willow moved to her dresser and quietly opened the bottom drawer, removing a small leather pouch containing the few pieces of jewelry that had been her mother's. She added the brooch her father had given her for her 18th birthday, and the pearl earrings that had been a wedding gift from her aunt in California. Next, she changed from her dinner dress into a simple skirt and blouse, adding a warm shawl. She would need to travel light, just the essentials. Into a small carpet bag, she packed an extra set of clothes, the jewelry pouch, and the miniature portrait of her parents that sat on her bedside table. From beneath her mattress, she retrieved the small amount of money she had managed to save from household funds over the past few months. Not much, but enough for a fresh start if she was careful. As she worked, she could hear Frank moving about downstairs, opening and closing cabinets, the familiar sounds of him pouring another drink. He would likely be up for at least another hour, possibly longer if he continued drinking. Willow sat on the edge of her bed, the packed bag beside her. If she did this, if she fled with Jack Everson, there would be no coming back. Frank would never forgive such defiance. He would hunt her down, both for the insult to his pride and because he would see her as property stolen from him. She was still sitting there, torn by indecision, when she heard Frank's heavy tread on the stairs. Quickly, she shoved the carpet bag under her bed and grabbed a book from her nightstand, opening it randomly as her bedroom door swung open without a knock. Frank stood in the doorway, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His face was flushed, his eyes slightly unfocused. "Still up?" he asked, his words slightly slurred. "I was just reading for a bit." Willow held up the book as evidence. "The dinner went well, I thought." Frank entered the room, closing the door behind him. He moved to stand by the window, looking out into the darkness. "Patterson's going to sell me that piece of his property that connects to the north pasture. Good price, too." Willow nodded, though alarm bells rang in her mind. They could barely meet their current obligations. Taking on more debt for more land was the last thing they should be doing. "That's good news," she said carefully. Frank turned to face her, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. "You don't sound convinced." "I'm just tired, Frank." "It's been a long day." He moved closer, standing over her. "You know, I've been patient with you, Willow, given you time to adjust to your father's passing, but your attitude lately—" He shook his head. "It's disrespectful." "I'm sorry if it seems that way." Willow closed her book, setting it aside. "I only want what's best for the ranch," Frank laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "What's best for the ranch is for you to remember who makes the decisions around here." He reached down, gripping her chin and forcing her to look up at him. "Your father understood his place in the world. Time you learned yours." Willow remained still, not wanting to provoke him further. After a moment, Frank released her and stepped back, draining his glass. "I'm going back downstairs to finish some paperwork. Don't wait up." He moved toward the door but paused with his hand on the knob. "And Willow, tomorrow we're going to have a serious talk about your duties as my wife. It's been too long since you've fulfilled all of them." The implied threat turned her blood cold. As soon as the door closed behind him, Willow moved to the window, looking out toward the cottonwoods. She could make out the faint shape of a horse and rider waiting in the shadows. Her decision was made. She retrieved the carpet bag from under the bed and moved to the window, opening it carefully to avoid any noise. The trellis Frank had installed the previous summer provided a way down, though the thorns from the climbing roses would make the descent painful. Willow took one last look around the room that had been her prison for the past 3 years, then slipped through the window and began her climb down into freedom, or perhaps another kind of danger altogether. Jack had begun to think Willow wouldn't come. It was well past 11, and the house had grown quiet, most of the lights extinguished except for a glow from what he assumed was Frank's study on the first floor. He'd almost convinced himself to leave that he'd misread the situation, or perhaps Willow had reconsidered when movement at her window caught his eye. A slender figure slipped out onto the trellis, carefully making her way down. Even from a distance, Jack could see it wasn't an easy descent. The roses that made the trellis so picturesque in daylight were a hazard in the dark, their thorns catching on Willow's clothing and, he suspected, her skin as well. Jack led his horse closer, staying in the shadows until Willow reached the ground. She paused, glancing back at the house before hurrying toward the trees, a small bag clutched in one hand. "Here," Jack called softly, stepping forward just enough for her to see him. Relief crossed Willow's face as she reached him. "I wasn't sure you'd still be waiting." "I said midnight," Jack replied simply. He helped her mount the horse, noting the small cuts on her hands from the rose thorns. "Are you all right?" Willow nodded, settling herself in the saddle. "Yes, but we should hurry. Frank's still awake in his study." Jack swung up behind her, acutely aware of her warmth against him as he reached around her for the reins. "Hold tight," he murmured, guiding the horse deeper into the trees before turning toward the open country beyond the ranch. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, putting distance between themselves and the Donovan ranch. Jack kept to lesser-used trails, avoiding the main road where they might be spotted. The moon was high, providing just enough light to navigate by without risking the horse's footing. Finally, when he judged they were far enough away for a brief rest, Jack reined in beside a small stream. "We should water the horse," he said, dismounting and helping Willow down. She stood uncertainly, glancing back the way they had come. "How far have we traveled?" "About 5 miles, but not in a straight line." Jack led the horse to the water. "We're heading south. I figured that would be unexpected. Most people fleeing would go west toward California or east to New Mexico." "Where are we going?" Willow asked, rubbing her arms against the night chill. Jack hesitated. "I hadn't planned that far ahead, to be honest. I have some money saved. Enough to get us to Tucson, maybe, where you could take a stage further south if you wanted." Willow moved to the stream, kneeling to wash the cuts on her hands. "I have an aunt in San Francisco. She's my mother's sister. We've corresponded over the years, though Frank didn't know. She's invited me to visit many times." "California, then," Jack said, nodding. "It's a good place to start fresh." Willow looked up at him, her expression serious in the moonlight. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Everson? Truly?" Jack knelt beside her, dipping his bandana in the cool water and offering it to her for her cuts. "Jack, please." He considered her question, wanting to give an honest answer. "I've seen men like your husband before. Men who think owning land means they can own people too, what he was planning." He shook his head. "I couldn't just ride away knowing what might happen. But you're risking so much if he catches us. Then we'll deal with that if it happens." Jack stood, offering his hand to help her up. "For now, we should keep moving. We can rest properly once we're well away from Gila City." Willow took his hand, rising gracefully despite her obvious fatigue. "Thank you," she said softly, "not just for helping me escape, but for giving me the choice." Something twisted in Jack's chest at her words. How long had it been since Willow Kearney Donovan had been allowed to make choices about her own life? "We should go," he said, helping her back onto the horse before mounting behind her. As they continued their journey south, Jack was aware of how Willow gradually relaxed against him, her exhaustion finally overtaking her fear. By dawn, they had traveled nearly 15 miles, keeping to the rough country away from established roads. Jack found a sheltered spot in a small canyon where a spring provided fresh water and cottonwood trees offered shade. "We'll rest here for a few hours," he said as they dismounted. "It's not safe to travel during daylight yet. We're still too close to Donovan's territory." Willow nodded, her face pale with exhaustion. Jack spread his bedroll on a patch of soft grass, gesturing for her to sit. "You should sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch." "What about you?" Willow asked, though she was already sinking onto the bedroll, her body betraying how desperately she needed rest. "I've gone longer without sleep," Jack assured her. "Part of being a trail hand. I'll wake you in a few hours." Willow nodded, her eyes already closing. Within minutes, her breathing deepened, and Jack knew she was asleep. He tended to the horse, ensuring it was watered and had grass to graze, then settled himself against a boulder with a clear view of both Willow and the approach to their small camp. The weight of what they were doing, what he had instigated, pressed on him now that he had time to think. Jack had never considered himself a particularly noble man. He'd worked hard, kept mostly to himself, and tried to do right by those he encountered. But this, helping a married woman flee her husband, was something else entirely. In the eyes of the law, he was likely committing a crime. In the eyes of society, he was interfering where he had no right. And yet, as he watched Willow sleeping, her face finally peaceful, Jack knew he couldn't have done otherwise. Whatever consequences came, he would face them. He must have dozed despite his intentions, because the next thing he knew, the sun had shifted position, and Willow was sitting up, watching him with an unreadable expression. "You were supposed to wake me," she said softly. Jack straightened, embarrassed to have been caught sleeping on watch. "Must have been more tired than I thought. What time is it?" "Nearly noon, I think." Willow had washed her face in the spring, and her hair was neatly rebraided. Despite the circumstances, there was a new energy about her, as if each mile from her husband restored something vital within her. "We should eat something before we move on," Jack said, reaching for his saddlebags. He extracted some jerky and hardtack along with a small tin of coffee. "It's not much, but it'll keep us going." "I brought some food too," Willow said, opening her carpet bag to reveal a small package wrapped in cloth. "Bread and cheese. I took it from the kitchen last night." They shared the simple meal in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. As they ate, Jack noticed Willow occasionally glancing at him, a question in her eyes that she seemed reluctant to voice. "What is it?" he finally asked. Willow hesitated, then asked, "What happens after we reach Tucson? Will you continue to California?" It was a question Jack had been asking himself. The sensible thing would be to help Willow secure passage to San Francisco and then return to his own life. But the thought of leaving her to make that journey alone troubled him. "I hadn't decided," he admitted. "What would you prefer?" Willow looked surprised, as if the idea that her preference mattered was novel. I don't want to impose on you further. You've already done more than anyone could expect." "That's not what I asked," Jack said gently. She looked down at her hands, the small cuts from the rose thorns already beginning to heal. "I would feel safer if you came with me," she said quietly. "But I understand if you can't. You have your own life, your own plans." Jack considered this. His plans had been vague at best: find work on another ranch, continue saving for his own land someday. Nothing that couldn't be adjusted. "I have some savings," he said. "Enough to get us both to California, I think, and I could find work there as easily as here." Hope flickered in Willow's eyes. "You would do that? I'm already in this deep," Jack said with a slight smile. "Might as well see it through." Willow reached out, briefly touching his hand. "Thank you, Jack." The simple gesture and the use of his first name sent an unexpected warmth through him. Jack reminded himself sternly that Willow was still legally married and undoubtedly traumatized by her situation. His role was to help her reach safety, nothing more. They packed up their meager supplies and continued south, keeping to the rough country but making good progress. By nightfall, they had covered another 20 miles, and Jack estimated they were now far enough from Gila City to risk a small fire. As darkness settled around their camp, Jack built a fire against the evening chill. Willow sat close to the flames, her face golden in the flickering light. For the first time, Jack allowed himself to truly look at her, not just the surface beauty that had first caught his attention in the saloon, but the strength beneath it. At 23, Willow had already endured more than many women twice her age. Her marriage to Frank had clearly been one of necessity rather than love, and Jack suspected it had grown increasingly oppressive over time. Yet here she was, facing an uncertain future with remarkable courage. "Tell me about your aunt in San Francisco," Jack said, hoping to keep her mind on the future rather than what they were fleeing. Willow's face brightened. "Aunt Alina. She's my mother's younger sister. She married a merchant who died several years ago, leaving her quite comfortable. She has no children of her own." A small smile played at her lips. "She was always the adventurous one in the family. My mother used to say Alina was born facing west, always looking toward the horizon. She sounds like someone who would understand your situation." Willow nodded. "She never approved of my marriage to Frank. She wrote to me afterward saying I could always come to her if I needed to." Her smile faded. "Frank intercepted most of her letters after that, but occasionally one would get through. And you're sure she'll welcome you now?" "Yes," Willow said without hesitation. "Alina believes in making one's own choices even when they're difficult ones." Jack added another stick to the fire. "How did you end up married to Donovan, if you don't mind my asking?" Willow was quiet for a moment, gazing into the flames. "My father's ranch was struggling after several dry years. Frank held notes on our property loans my father had taken to keep going during the drought. When the rains finally came, it should have been enough to turn things around, but Frank called in the loans suddenly." She twisted a loose thread on her sleeve. "The only way to save the ranch was for me to marry him. My father was devastated, but he had no choice." "And you had no choice," Jack said softly. "No." Willow's voice was barely audible above the crackling fire. "I was 19. Frank was 37 and already known as a hard man but a successful one. My father thought he would at least treat me well, give me a comfortable life. But he didn't." Willow shook her head. "He was controlling from the beginning. But after my father died last year, There was no one left to witness how he treated me. That's when things got worse. Jack felt a surge of anger toward Frank Donovan, a man who had used his wealth and power to trap a young woman and then treated her as property rather than a wife. "I'm sorry you had to endure that. It wasn't all terrible," Willow said, surprising him. "I had the ranch, the land I grew up loving, and books. Frank never understood why I cared about reading, so he ignored my small library." A genuine smile crossed her face. "I read everything I could find. Traveled the world through pages when I couldn't leave the ranch in person." "What's your favorite?" Jack asked, struck by how her face came alive when she talked about books. "Austen," Willow said without hesitation. "Pride and Prejudice especially." She looked slightly embarrassed. "I know it's silly to love romance novels, but there's something about the way she writes about people so clear-sighted but also compassionate." "I've never read it," Jack admitted. "Most of my reading has been practical almanacs, newspapers, the occasional dime novel when I could get one." "You should try it someday," Willow said. "There's more wisdom in Austen than in most of the serious books men prefer." Jack smiled, enjoying this glimpse of the woman Willow must have been before Frank Donovan's oppression dimmed her spirit. "I'll remember that." They fell silent, the fire crackling between them. After a while, Willow spoke again, her voice hesitant. "Jack, what will happen if Frank catches up to us?" It was a question Jack had been avoiding, but one that needed answering. "He won't," he said with more confidence than he felt. "We've been careful, avoiding the main trails. By the time he organizes a search, we'll be well on our way to Tucson. But if he does," Jack met her gaze steadily, "then I'll make sure you get away. And you." "I can handle myself," Jack said, though they both knew that Frank Donovan's influence meant any confrontation would be decidedly one-sided in terms of the law. Willow looked troubled. "I shouldn't have let you get involved. This isn't your fight." "I made it my fight when I offered to help you," Jack said firmly. "And I don't regret it." They gazed at each other across the fire, something unspoken passing between them, a recognition of the bond that had formed through their shared danger and the trust Willow had placed in him. Jack broke the moment, standing to check on the horse and gather more firewood. "We should get some rest. I'd like to start before dawn to cover more ground before the heat sets in." Willow nodded, settling herself on the bedroll Jack had again insisted she use while he took first watch. As she drifted toward sleep, Jack found himself studying her face in the firelight, struck by how quickly this woman had come to matter to him. It wasn't just her beauty, though that was undeniable. It was her resilience, her quiet dignity in the face of circumstances that would have broken many others. Jack had always prided himself on his independence, on needing no one. But as he watched Willow sleep, he realized that helping her had awakened something in him he hadn't known was missing, a sense of purpose beyond his own survival. Whatever happened in the days ahead, Jack knew his life had already changed irrevocably. And somehow, despite the danger, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. The next 3 days followed a similar pattern, traveling at dawn and dusk, resting during the hottest part of the day, always keeping to the less traveled routes. They fell into an easy rhythm together, sharing the small tasks of making and breaking camp, dividing their dwindling supplies, talking about everything and nothing as the miles passed beneath the horses' hooves. Jack found himself increasingly drawn to Willow's quiet strength and intelligence. She had a way of observing the world that reminded him there was beauty to be found even in the harshest landscapes. And when she smiled, really smiled, not the careful mask she'd worn in the saloon, it transformed her face in a way that made his chest tighten. For her part, Willow seemed to grow lighter with each day of freedom, as if shedding the weight of her marriage with every mile they traveled. She spoke more freely, laughed more often, and sometimes Jack caught her looking at him with an expression he dared not interpret. On the fourth day, they reached a small settlement where Jack judged it safe enough to replenish their supplies. The trading post was run by an elderly Mexican couple who asked no questions when Jack purchased food, ammunition for the rifle he carried, and a second blanket. "We're about 2 days from Tucson now," Jack said as they made camp that evening. "Once we're there, we can find out about transportation to California." Willow nodded, though Jack noticed a shadow pass across her face. "What is it?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "I was just thinking about what happens when we reach San Francisco. I haven't seen Aunt Alina in years, and I have no skills, no way to support myself if she can't help me." "You underestimate yourself," Jack said. "You're intelligent, well-read, and stronger than you know. You'll find your way." "And what about you?" Willow asked. "What will you do in California?" Jack shrugged. "What I've always done, I suppose. Find work, save money." But even as he said it, he realized his old dreams of a small ranch of his own somewhere in the territory seemed less compelling now. Willow was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've been thinking. My aunt's last letter mentioned that she's involved with a women's education society in San Francisco. Perhaps I could teach. I've always loved books and I had a good education before." She trailed off. "Before you were forced to marry Donovan," Jack finished for her. "I think you'd make an excellent teacher." A genuine smile lit Willow's face. "It would be a way to support myself, to have independence." Jack nodded, though the thought of Willow building a new life in San Francisco, a life that wouldn't include him, brought an unexpected pang. "You deserve that independence," he said sincerely. They ate their simple dinner as darkness settled around them, the familiar companionable silence between them now tinged with an awareness that their journey together was approaching its end. As Jack banked the fire for the night, Willow suddenly asked, "What about your family, Jack?" "You've never mentioned them." The question caught him off guard. "Not much to tell. My father was a farmer in Missouri. After the war, he couldn't make the land pay anymore. My mother died when I was 14. By 16, I was on my own working cattle drives. No siblings. A brother who went east to find work in the factories. We write occasionally." Jack stretched out his bedroll. "It's your turn to take the first sleep. I'll wake you in a few hours." But Willow didn't move toward her blankets. Instead, she remained seated, her arms wrapped around her knees, looking at Jack with an intensity that made him nervous. "What is it?" he asked. "I've been trying to understand why you've done all this for me," she said slowly. "At first I thought perhaps it was simple decency. You heard a threat and acted to prevent harm. But it's more than that, isn't it?" Jack looked away, uncomfortable with her directness. "Like I said, it was the right thing to do." "Jack." The way she said his name made him look back at her. "Please don't evade the question. I need to understand." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not sure I understand it myself, Willow. When I saw you in that saloon, there was something about you that, I don't know, made me want to know you better. And then when I heard Donovan threatening you," he shook his head, "I couldn't just walk away, even knowing the risk, that you could be charged with kidnapping or worse, even then." Jack met her gaze steadily now. "Some things are worth the risk." Willow's eyes searched his face. "And now?" After these days together, the question hung between them, fraught with implications neither had dared voice. Jack knew he should be cautious, remind himself that Willow was still legally married, that she was vulnerable, that his feelings might be nothing more than the natural result of their intense circumstances. But there was something in her eyes, a clarity, a certainty that demanded honesty in return. "Now," he said quietly, "I can't imagine not having met you, Willow. Whatever happens when we reach California, knowing you has changed me." She moved then, closing the distance between them and taking his hand in hers. "It's changed me too, Jack. You've shown me what it means to be treated with respect, with kindness." Her voice dropped to a whisper. With care, Jack's heart pounded as he looked down at their joined hands. "Willow, you're still married," she finished for him. "I know, legally at least." Her eyes were steady on his. "But in my heart, that marriage ended long ago if it ever truly existed." "Even so," Jack said, though it cost him to do so, "when we reach San Francisco, you'll need time. Time to establish yourself, to be certain of what you want." Willow's expression softened. "You're a good man, Jack Everson." "Better than I deserved to find that night." Before he could respond, she leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, then rose and moved to her bedroll. "Wake me for my watch," she said, and Jack nodded, not trusting his voice. As she settled down to sleep, Jack remained where he was, his hand touching the spot where her lips had brushed his skin, feeling like something fundamental had shifted between them, something that could not be undone. The next morning dawned clear and hot, with no sign of the gathering clouds that might have warned them of the danger approaching. They broke camp efficiently, falling into their now familiar routine, though there was a new awareness between them after the previous night's conversation. They had been riding for perhaps an hour when Jack noticed dust on the horizon behind them. He reined in, standing in the stirrups to get a better view. "What is it?" Willow asked, sensing his tension. "Riders," Jack said grimly. "At least 4 moving fast." Willow's face paled. "Frank?" "Could be," Jack admitted. "Or just travelers hurrying to reach shelter before the heat of the day." But he didn't believe that, and he could tell Willow didn't either. "What do we do?" Jack considered their options. They were still at least a day's ride from Tucson, and their horse, carrying double, couldn't outrun fresh mounts. They could try to hide, but in this open country with experienced trackers, that was unlikely to succeed. "There's a canyon about a mile ahead," he said, making a decision. "It has some defensible positions. We'll head there." They pushed on at the fastest pace they dared, but it was soon clear the riders behind them were gaining. When they reached the mouth of the canyon, Jack had remembered from a previous journey. He helped Willow dismount, then quickly led their horse into a natural alcove where it would be hidden from immediate view. "This way," he said, guiding Willow up a narrow path that led to a ledge overlooking the canyon floor. It wasn't ideal, but it offered some protection and a good vantage point. As they settled into position, Jack checked his rifle and the revolver at his hip. He had ammunition for both, but not enough for a prolonged fight. "Jack," Willow said quietly, "if it is Frank, you should let me face him. This isn't your fight." He looked at her incredulously. "After everything he's threatened to do to you?" "No, Willow, we're in this together now." Before she could argue further, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. Jack motioned for Willow to stay down as he peered carefully over the edge of their hiding place. 4 riders entered the canyon, moving cautiously now, scanning the terrain. In the lead was Frank Donovan, his face set in hard lines of rage. Behind him rode 3 men Jack recognized as ranch hands from the Donovan spread. "Willow." Frank's voice boomed through the canyon. "I know you're here. Come out now and I might forgive this foolishness." Jack felt Willow tense beside him, but she remained silent. "Is that Cowboy with you?" Frank continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "The one from the saloon. Did he fill your head with nonsense about running away?" He paused, then added ominously, "He won't live to regret it if he did." Jack met Willow's frightened gaze, placing a reassuring hand on her arm. "Stay here," he whispered, "no matter what happens." Then, before she could stop him, Jack stood, revealing his position. "She's not coming back to you, Donovan," he called down, his rifle held ready but not yet aimed. Frank's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Jack on the ledge. "You," he snarled. "I should have known. Where's my wife? Safe from you," Jack replied evenly. "And that's how she's going to stay." Frank's laugh was ugly. "You think you're protecting her. All you've done is ruin her. No one will take in a woman who's run off with another man. She's damaged goods now." Jack fought to keep his temper in check, knowing Donovan was trying to provoke him. "The only damage done to Willow was by your hands, Donovan. I heard you in the saloon, planning to harm her. That's why I helped her leave." Frank's face darkened with rage. "You're a liar and a thief, Cowboy. You stole my property, and I've got 3 witnesses here who'll testify to that." He gestured to the men behind him. "The law's on my side, not yours." "The law doesn't allow a man to threaten his wife's life," Jack retorted. "Hearsay," Frank dismissed. "Your word against mine. And who do you think they'll believe? A drifting cowhand or one of the largest landowners in the territory?" He had a point, and Jack knew it. In a court of law, Frank Donovan's influence would almost certainly prevail. "Willow," Frank called, his voice suddenly silky. "I know you can hear me. Come out now and I'll be lenient. We can put this behind us. After all, a good wife stands by her husband, doesn't she? Like your mother stood by your father through all his failures." Jack felt Willow stiffen beside him, and before he could stop her, she rose to stand next to him on the ledge. "My mother stood by my father because she loved him," Willow called down, her voice steady despite her fear. "And because he treated her with respect, something you've never shown me, Frank." Frank's expression hardened. "You've had it too easy, Willow. That's the problem. I gave you everything: a fine house, good clothes, a respected position in society. And this is how you repay me. By running off with the first drifter who catches your eye." "You never gave me anything," Willow responded, a new strength in her voice. "You took everything: my home, my freedom, my dignity. But you won't take my future, Frank. I'm not coming back." Frank's hand moved to his gun. "Then I'll take the future from both of you." He nodded to his men. "Spread out. If she won't come willingly, we'll bring her by force. And as for her cowboy friend—" He let the implication hang in the air. Jack pushed Willow back from the edge as the men below began to fan out, seeking ways up to their position. "We need to move," he said urgently. "There's another path down the back side of this ridge. If we can reach it, we might be able to circle around to our horse." They scrambled along the narrow ledge, keeping low to avoid being seen. Behind them, they could hear Frank barking orders to his men, their boots scraping on stone as they searched for a way up. The path, Jack remembered, was steep and treacherous, but it offered their best chance. "Careful," he warned as they began their descent. "One step at a time." They had made it perhaps halfway down when a shout from above indicated they had been spotted. A shot rang out, the bullet striking rock near Jack's head, sending fragments flying. "Keep going," he urged Willow, turning to fire back, more to slow their pursuers than with any real hope of hitting them at this distance. They reached the canyon floor and ran toward the spot where they had left their horse, ducking between boulders for cover as more shots followed them. Jack could hear Frank's voice, enraged, ordering his men to cut them off. When they reached the alcove, Jack's heart sank. Their horse was gone, either spooked by the gunfire or found and taken by one of Donovan's men. "This way," he said, pulling Willow toward a dense thicket of scrub oak and mesquite that offered some cover. "We need to reach that ridgeline. If we can get over it, there's a small settlement about 5 miles beyond." They pushed through the brush, thorns tearing at their clothing, the sounds of pursuit growing closer. Jack kept Willow ahead of him, ready to turn and fight if necessary. But he knew they couldn't outrun mounted men for long, not in this terrain, not in this heat. They had almost reached the base of the ridge when Frank's voice called out from much closer than expected. "That's far enough." Jack turned to see Frank emerge from behind a boulder less than 30 yards away, his revolver aimed directly at them. Two of his men appeared on either side, effectively cutting off any escape. "It's over," Frank said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Drop your gun, cowboy." Jack hesitated, calculating their chances. They weren't good. "Don't be stupid," Frank warned. "Drop it now, or I'll put a bullet in you and tell the sheriff it was self-defense." No one would question it. With reluctance, Jack lowered his rifle to the ground. Willow stood beside him, her face pale but resolute. Frank approached, his gun still trained on Jack. "You should have minded your own business, cowboy. Now you'll pay the price for stealing what's mine." "I'm not yours, Frank," Willow said, stepping slightly forward. "I never really was." Frank's eyes flickered to her, then back to Jack. "Bind his hands," he ordered one of his men. "We'll let the law deal with him properly, though I doubt he'll make it all the way to jail." The threat was clear in his tone. As the ranch hand moved to comply, Jack tensed, ready to fight despite the odds. But before anyone could move further, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. "Riders coming," one of Frank's men called, pointing toward the mouth of the canyon. Frank cursed. "Who the hell?" He didn't finish the question as the newcomers came into view, 4 men on horseback, moving with purpose. In the lead was a figure Jack recognized immediately, Sheriff Thomas from Gila City. "Donovan," the sheriff called as they approached. "Stand down, lower your weapon." Frank's expression was one of confusion quickly masked by confidence. "Sheriff, good timing. I've just apprehended the man who abducted my wife." The sheriff dismounted, his own gun drawn but pointed at the ground. "That's not the story I heard, Donovan." He looked at Willow. "Mrs. Donovan, are you all right?" "Yes, Sheriff," Willow said, her voice stronger than Jack would have expected given the circumstances. "She's confused," Frank said quickly. "This drifter filled her head with nonsense, convinced her to run away." "Is that so?" The sheriff's tone was skeptical. He turned to one of the men who had accompanied him, a young ranch hand Jack had seen around Gila City. "Reynolds, tell Mr. Donovan what you told me." The young man shifted uncomfortably but met Frank's glare. "I was at the saloon that day, Mr. Donovan. I heard what you said about Mrs. Donovan, about an accident happening to her. I heard every word." Frank's face drained of color, then flushed with rage. "You're lying." "No, sir, I'm not." Reynolds stood his ground. "And I wasn't the only one who heard. Clara Parker did too. She came to the sheriff right after you left town, worried about Mrs. Donovan." Sheriff Thomas nodded. "Clara was quite clear about what she heard, Donovan, and when we found out Mrs. Donovan had disappeared and you'd gathered men to pursue her." He shook his head. "Didn't look good." "This is absurd," Frank blustered. "She's my wife. I have the right, you don't have the right to threaten her life," the sheriff interrupted firmly. "Now lower your weapon, Donovan. You're coming back to Gila City to answer some questions." For a tense moment, Jack thought Frank might try to shoot his way out. But as he looked around at the sheriff's men, all with hands near their guns, he seemed to reconsider. With a curse, he lowered his revolver. "This isn't over," he said, glaring at Willow and then at Jack. "I think it is," Sheriff Thomas replied. He gestured to his deputies to take charge of Frank and his men. "Mrs. Donovan, Mr. Everson, I'll need statements from both of you as well." As the deputies disarmed Frank and his ranch hands, Willow moved closer to Jack, her hand finding his. "It's really over," she whispered. Jack squeezed her hand, hardly able to believe the turn of events himself. "Looks that way." The sheriff approached them, his expression grave but not unkind. "Mrs. Donovan, I've known your family for many years. Your father was a good man. I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening sooner." Willow nodded, accepting his words. "What will happen now, Sheriff?" That depends partly on you, Thomas said. If you're willing to testify about your husband's treatment of you, along with the threats witnessed by others, he'll face serious charges. And if I don't, Willow asked. The sheriff sighed. Then it becomes more complicated, but given the witnesses to his threats, he won't simply walk away. Willow straightened her shoulders. I'll testify. It's time the truth was known. Sheriff Thomas nodded, then turned to Jack. As for you, Mr. Everson, your actions were unorthodox, but under the circumstances, I understand why you felt compelled to intervene. Will there be charges against him? Willow asked anxiously. That depends on the judge, Thomas replied honestly. But I'll make it clear in my report that Mr. Everson acted to prevent harm to you based on credible threats he overheard. He left them then to oversee the preparations for the journey back to Gila City. Jack turned to Willow, studying her face in the harsh sunlight. Despite the ordeal, there was a new steadiness in her eyes, a certainty that hadn't been there before. Are you all right? He asked quietly. Willow nodded, a small smile touching her lips. Better than all right. For the first time in years, I feel free. Jack wanted to pull her into his arms, but was acutely aware of the eyes upon them. What will you do now? He asked instead. Face him, Willow said simply. Tell the truth. And then, she looked toward the horizon. And then I'll still go to California, start the life I should have had all along. Her words brought both relief and a pang of uncertainty to Jack. And you'll be all right, making that journey. Willow's eyes met his, warm with an emotion Jack dared not name yet. I was rather hoping I wouldn't be making it alone, she said softly. Unless you've changed your mind. Jack felt something tight in his chest finally loosen. I meant what I said last night, Willow. Knowing you has changed everything for me. She smiled then, a real smile that lit her entire face. Good. Because I think we have a lot more to learn about each other, Jack Everson. Before he could respond, Sheriff Thomas called for them to mount up. One of his deputies had recovered their horse, and as they prepared to join the journey back to Gila City, Jack found himself filled with a cautious hope for the future, a future that now seemed full of possibilities he had never dared to imagine. 3 months later, Jack stood on the deck of a steamer bound for San Francisco, watching as the coastline of California came into view through the early morning fog. Beside him, Willow leaned against the railing, her face turned toward the promise of land ahead. The legal proceedings against Frank Donovan had moved with surprising swiftness, thanks in part to the influential testimony of Clara Parker and several other residents of Gila City, who came forward with accounts of Frank's increasingly erratic and threatening behavior. The final blow to his defense had been the discovery of ledgers showing he had systematically defrauded not only Willow's father but several other ranchers in the area. Frank now faced years in territorial prison, and the court had granted Willow an annulment based on fraud and coercion, along with restoration of her father's property. She had promptly sold the land, using part of the proceeds to assist those Frank had harmed and setting aside the rest for a new beginning in California. As for Jack, he had been cleared of any wrongdoing, the judge ruling that his actions were justified given the immediate threat to Willow's safety. In the weeks that followed, as they prepared for their journey west, he and Willow had grown closer, their bond deepening into something neither had expected to find. Now, as San Francisco's harbor emerged from the mist, Jack felt Willow's hand slip into his. "Nervous?" he asked. She shook her head, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Excited. I never thought I'd actually be here, starting fresh." Jack squeezed her hand. "Your aunt's letter sounded welcoming. I think she'll be happy to see you." "And to meet you," Willow added, a teasing note in her voice. "Though I'm not sure how she'll feel about me arriving with a cowboy in tow." Former cowboy, Jack corrected with a smile. Soon to be. He hesitated, still adjusting to the idea of his new direction. Soon to be bookshop owner, Willow finished for him. And a very good one, I'm certain. The plan had developed gradually over their journey west. Jack's savings, combined with a small investment from Willow, would be enough to purchase a modest bookshop in one of San Francisco's growing neighborhoods. It was a far cry from the cattle ranch he had once envisioned, but somehow it felt right, a place of stories and ideas, of quiet conversations and new discoveries. As the steamer made its final approach to the harbor, other passengers joined them at the railing, eager for their first glimpse of the city. But Jack found his gaze drawn to Willow rather than the approaching shoreline. The woman beside him now was transformed from the one he had first seen in the Silver Dollar Saloon, still beautiful, but with a confidence and joy that made her radiant. "What are you thinking?" Willow asked, catching his look. "That I'm the luckiest man alive," Jack said honestly. "And that I never expected to find happiness by overhearing a conversation in a saloon." Willow's expression softened. "I think about that day often, how close we came to never meeting. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't heard." She shuddered slightly. Jack wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "But I was there, and now we're here." As the steamer docked and passengers began gathering their belongings, Jack and Willow lingered for a moment longer, watching the bustling activity of the harbor. "Ready?" Jack asked finally. Willow nodded, her eyes meeting his with the same clarity and certainty he had seen that night by the campfire. "More than ready." They disembarked together, stepping onto the soil of their new home, the past behind them and the future stretching ahead like an open book, waiting to be filled with their story, a story of courage, of second chances, and of a love that had begun with a cowboy who had overheard a threat and left a horse ready by a window. 5 years later, on a crisp autumn morning in 1882, Jack stood in the doorway of Everson Books, watching the early light filter through the bay window onto shelves filled with carefully selected volumes. The small bell above the door jingled as a customer entered, and Jack turned with a welcoming smile. "Good morning, Professor. The new shipment from Boston arrived yesterday, including that edition of Thoreau you've been waiting for." The elderly academic's face lit up. "Excellent news, Mr. Everson. My students will be delighted." As Jack retrieved the book from behind the counter, the professor glanced around the shop appreciatively. "You've built something special here, young man, a true haven for readers." "My wife deserves most of the credit," Jack replied, wrapping the volume in brown paper. "She has the literary expertise, I just keep the accounts." "A formidable partnership," the professor noted with a knowing smile. "How is Mrs. Everson and the little one?" Jack's face softened at the mention of his family. "Both thriving, thank you. Charlotte's just turned 3 and already has her mother's love of stories." After completing the transaction and seeing the professor out, Jack moved to straighten a display of new novels. The shop had prospered beyond his expectations, becoming a gathering place for the neighborhood's growing community of readers, writers, and thinkers. What had started as a small venture had expanded to include a reading room and regular literary discussions, led by Willow, whose knowledge and passion for books had quickly earned her respect in San Francisco's intellectual circles. The back door opened, and Jack looked up to see Willow enter from their living quarters behind the shop, little Charlotte in her arms. The sight still made his heart skip a beat. His wife, with her chestnut hair now styled in the fashion of the city, though still with those rebellious strands that refused to stay in place, and their daughter, a perfect blend of them both, with Jack's blue eyes and Willow's determined chin. "Papa." Charlotte squirmed to be put down, running to Jack as soon as her feet touched the floor. He swept her up, breathing in the clean scent of her hair as she wrapped her small arms around his neck. "Good morning, my little bookworm," he said, planting a kiss on her cheek. "Have you been helping Mama?" Charlotte nodded solemnly. "I shelved all my books. Alphabetical order," she added with the precise pronunciation of a child repeating an important new word. Jack glanced at Willow, who was watching them with amusement. "She's very insistent about the proper arrangement of her picture books," Willow explained. "I can't imagine where she gets that from. Clearly her mother's influence," Jack said with a grin, setting Charlotte down. The little girl immediately headed for her special corner of the shop, where a small table and chair held a carefully curated selection of children's books. Willow moved closer, lowering her voice. "Aunt Aliner's letter arrived this morning. She'll be back from Europe next month and is looking forward to seeing us, especially Charlotte." Jack nodded, grateful as always for Aliner Warren's unwavering support. Willow's aunt had welcomed them warmly upon their arrival in San Francisco, opening her home and her extensive social connections to help them establish themselves. Her investment in their bookshop had been crucial, but even more valuable had been her belief in their vision. "She'll find her great niece has grown considerably since her departure," Jack observed, "both in height and in opinions." Willow laughed. "That she has." Her expression grew more thoughtful. "I also had a letter from Clara Parker. She says Gila City is changing rapidly, the railroad's coming through next year." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Do you ever miss it? Arizona, I mean." Willow considered the question, her eyes drifting to the window where San Francisco's morning fog was beginning to lift, revealing glimpses of the bay beyond. "I miss the land sometimes, the openness, the way the stars looked at night, but not the life I had there." She met his gaze, her eyes clear and direct as always. "This is home now, with you and Charlotte." Jack reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I was thinking we might take a trip next summer, show Charlotte some of the country, perhaps even visit Clara." "I'd like that," Willow said, surprising him. "It would be good to see it all again, but as a visitor this time, and to show our daughter where her parents met." "A somewhat edited version of events," Jack suggested with a wry smile. "Of course. Though someday she'll know the whole story, how brave her father was, and how he saved me." Jack shook his head. "You saved yourself, Willow. I just provided the horse." "We saved each other," she corrected him softly, "and continue to do so every day." The bell above the door jingled again, announcing the arrival of more customers. Willow squeezed Jack's hand once more before moving to greet them, her natural warmth and knowledge quickly engaging them in conversation about the latest literary arrivals from Europe. Jack watched her for a moment, still sometimes amazed by the turn his life had taken. From a solitary cowboy with modest dreams to a husband, father, and business owner in a city he had never imagined calling home. All because he had paused long enough to overhear a conversation in a saloon and had cared enough to act. Charlotte approached, tugging at his sleeve with a book in her hand. "Papa, will you read to me? Until customers need you." "Always," Jack said, lifting her onto the counter and settling beside her. As he opened the book, one of the many fairy tales his daughter loved, he caught Willow's eye across the shop. She smiled at him, a smile full of love and promise, before turning back to her customers. In that moment, surrounded by books and with his daughter's small hand resting trustingly in his, Jack Everson knew with absolute certainty that every risk, every decision, every step of the journey had led exactly where he was meant to be, home, in the truest sense of the word, with the family that had begun with an act of courage on a summer night long ago.